Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the historical record to see exactly how the actions of U.S. presidents have, time and time again, tested and ultimately eroded public trust. Throughout American history, the highest office in the land has been held by individuals who sometimes push the boundaries of their authority right to the absolute limit. We're going to examine this fascinating and, honestly, sometimes troubling pattern of executive overreach, systemic failures, and flat-out scandals.
So it really begs the question, what actually happens when the commander-in-chief bends or just outright breaks the rules? As you'll see, the consequences shift pretty dramatically over time. We're going from constitutional tugs of war back in the 1800s all the way to massive systemic intelligence failures in the modern era. But the one constant through it all? A steady chipping away at the public's faith.
All right, let's jump right into part one, early power and inaction.
We're starting back in the 19th century, where the foundation for presidential controversy was really laid by two extremes: massive executive overreach and disastrous inaction. Andrew Jackson, for instance, came into office with this huge mandate for what he called reform, but it very quickly turned into an aggressive expansion of executive power. He initiated sweeping removals of high-ranking government officials. He aggressively pushed through the Indian Removal Act of 1830, literally defying the Supreme Court to force Native American tribes west of the Mississippi, and he justified the whole shebang under the guise of efficiency. But, as you might guess, that efficiency had a pretty dark side. Defending Jackson's partisan appointments, Senator William L. Marcy famously declared, "To the victor belong the spoils of the enemy." And with that, Jackson inadvertently created what we call the spoil system. Government offices were suddenly just doled out as rewards for political loyalty. This led to massive corruption. In one shocking example, an appointee named Samuel Swartwout was made collector of the New York City Custom House against literally everyone's advice. Well, in 1838, he absconded with more than $1 million. That was a completely staggering amount of money back then. Now, while Jackson maybe did way too much, James Buchanan's presidency was marred by the exact opposite: catastrophic inaction. Buchanan was actually secretly tipped off about the infamous Dred Scott decision, and he actively supported a ruling that denied citizenship to Black Americans. Yet as the nation was hurtling toward the Civil War, he basically just threw his hands up. He literally called the territorial issue of slavery a matter of but little practical importance and declared he had absolutely no constitutional power to stop states from seceding. Let's move on to Section 2, the first presidential impeachment. So Buchanan's catastrophic inaction obviously set the stage for the Civil War. And what's incredible about the constitutional crisis that followed is just how incredibly fast it moved. President Andrew Johnson was clashing bitterly with Congress over how to reconstruct the defeated South. To box him in, Congress passed the 10-Year of Office Act to restrict his power. Defying them, on February 21, 1868, Johnson illegally fired his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. Just 3 days later, the House of Representatives voted to impeach him. It was the first ever presidential impeachment in U.S. history. And he was acquitted by literally a single vote, 35-19. The Senate fell just one vote short of the two-thirds majority they needed to actually remove him from office. Now, although Johnson survived and stayed in power, that grueling trial permanently weakened his presidency and proved once and for all that the executive branch wasn't untouchable. Which brings us to Section 3, War, Secrets, and Escalation. Fast forward to the mid-20th century, and the whole nature of these presidential controversies really starts to shift. It's no longer just about constitutional battles over who gets appointed to what. It becomes about secretive warfare and actively misleading the public on a global stage. In 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson's administration used the alleged Gulf of Tonkin incident, claiming there were unprovoked attacks on U.S. ships, to get a broad congressional mandate to escalate the Vietnam War. But as the declassified reality later revealed, the attack was vastly exaggerated. In fact, some elements of it never happened at all. The fallout from this deception was just immense. LBJ had endorsed Option C for graduated military intensity, which heavily escalated the conflict. By actively misleading the public to justify all this, Johnson severely damaged the nation's trust in its government. This fueled massive, nationwide anti-war protests and ultimately forced Johnson to completely abandon his 1968 re-election campaign. The credibility gap hadn't just widened, it had become a total chasm. Let's look at Section 4, Watergate shatters public trust. That erosion of trust we saw start in the 1960s, well, it absolutely culminated in the 1970s with a scandal that shattered any remaining illusions the public had left. We are talking, of course, about Watergate. In 1972, burglars linked to Richard Nixon's campaign were caught spying on the Democratic offices, and what followed was a massive, calculated cover-up directed straight from the White House itself. The undeniable proof came out in the form of secret Oval Office recordings, specifically the smoking gun tape, which proved Nixon was guilty of criminal conspiracy and obstruction of justice. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon officially resigned in August 1974. And the impact on the country? Just 35%. Between 1973 and 1974, the percentage of Americans who viewed the president as a man of high integrity plummeted from 63% down to a mere 35%. It's a truly stunning representation of that bond breaking between American citizens and their government.
And that leads us into Section 5, Modern Scandals and Intelligence.
In the post-Watergate era, the scrutiny on the Oval Office became incredibly intense, and the lines between personal and public trust got pretty blurry. In 1998, President Bill Clinton faced impeachment. After initially denying and then later admitting under oath to an inappropriate relationship with a White House intern, the House of Representatives impeached him on charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. Though he was acquitted by the Senate, the whole ordeal sparked a fierce national debate about exactly where we draw the line between personal misconduct and the public trust required of the highest office.
But honestly, perhaps nothing highlights the modern complexities of presidential trust quite like the events of 2003. Here's how it unfolded. First, the George W. Bush administration strongly claimed that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs. Second, based heavily on those intelligence claims, the U.S. launched an invasion. And third, and obviously most critically, no WMDs were ever found. It was a catastrophic intelligence failure that plunged the country into a prolonged conflict.
After the fact, a formal commission was tasked with investigating exactly how the entire intelligence community failed so spectacularly. In 2005, they sent a direct formal letter detailing their findings straight to the president. And their findings, they were incredibly blunt. The commission concluded that the intelligence community was, quote, dead wrong in almost all of its pre-war judgments. They cited an inability to collect good information, serious analytical errors, and a really dangerous reliance on assumptions over hard evidence. But here is the absolute most crucial takeaway from that entire report. The commission stated, what the intelligence professionals told you about Saddam Hussein's programs was what they believed. They were simply wrong. Interestingly, they found zero indication that the evidence was distorted for political reasons. And in a way, that's almost more unsettling. It proves that massive systemic errors by institutions we trust can be just as damaging to public faith as the intentional, calculated deceptions we saw during Watergate. Which brings us to the end of our explainer, and to this final, really vital question. From Andrew Jackson's spoils system to Nixon's cover-ups and these modern intelligence failures, the historical record shows this continuous cycle of faith being built up and then broken down. As executive power only continues to expand, what safeguards, if any, can ensure that future generations are able to hold the highest office accountable? It's definitely something every informed citizen needs to be thinking about. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world today.